Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer, and for this week's discussion board, we had to consider some of the sampling methods that were presented in the module, select two to critique as it related to our submitted needs assessment, and then just talk about the two samples we chose, listing two pros, two cons, and then which one we would choose for our needs assessment itself. So out of all of the different sampling methods that were available in the model, I picked purposeful sampling and then simple random sampling. Um, so purposeful sampling, as mentioned by Palinkanes in 2015. It's used widely in qualitative research for identification and selection of information-rich cases for the most effective use of limited resources. It helps to identify and select individuals, groups of individuals that are knowledgeable about an experience, especially as it relates to what's being researched. So this type of sampling, like I said, it selects people who are familiar with what it is the researchers are trying to investigate. So the purpose of one of the pros for purpose sampling, it can really be helpful in showing the need for an evidence-based approach among programs. It also supports the mixed method design as an appropriate research method as it relates to data research for some of these programs. For me, when I did my needs assessment, my needs assessment was based on reentry programs, and do reentry programs help reduce recidivism rates among offenders? So this purposeful sampling, it would have been important to my needs assessment, as when I was doing research, there was very limited data available for an evidence-based approach for some of these reentry programs for their implementation. And so that reflected in my needs assessment as what I could find. It was very contradictory to each other. I think I maybe found one or two sources that had an evidence-based approach. So like I said, this would be helpful as it's very, there was limited current data on that. Second pro would be purposeful sampling can assist programs in understanding what may be working or not working as it relates to evidence-based implementations. So what I found from an article online, it said that, purposeful sampling, it can allow for comparison with other programs that offer similar interventions or implementations, like on a statewide level. So it allows for comparison to see, this program's working well doing this, or it's not working well doing that. How does that compare to us? Again, when I was doing my needs assessment, that was limited information that I could find. It was very difficult to understand if reentry programs are successful in lowering the recidivism rate. So if I was able to find some research data study with purposeful sampling, that may have been helpful. Two cons that I found, or things that could be difficult with this type of sampling, it's just that it could be challenging in identifying and applying the appropriate strategy for the program study. So what that's talking about is that, it's hard to identify the variation range for the study. That's not always known, it's assumed. So, when you're doing a research study on an assumption, that's hard to have accurate, unbiased data when you're doing something on an assumption. Another con was that because it's a purposeful sample study, and you're being, mindful of who you choose to be in the study, you have to, researchers have to reveal their reasoning for the people that they're choosing to have in the study. So that can sometimes cause ethical concerns, as you would have to reveal, the information of the people in your sample, why they're in the sample, how they're relevant to what's being studied, that sort of thing. The other sample study that I chose was random samples. So a simple random sample is an unbiased approach to use to gain responses from large groups. So how this relates to my needs assessment, I actually found it was a random controlled trial with data information, and they used simple sample sizes and things like that. And what I found when I did my needs assessment is that the data was very, again, contradictory of each other. It was very difficult to see if implementations were working or if they weren't. But two pros that were listed for random sample or simple random sampling was that it creates a lack of bias. Everybody in the group that's being sampled gets to participate. There's no like standards, oh, you can participate, but you can't, or you have to qualify in this kind of way. That would have been helpful because one of the research, some of the data that I came across had available data for a reentry program, but you had to, one, be enrolled in the program, and then you had to be gainfully employed to participate in the study. So as you can see, that can kind of bias your results because you're limiting who you're sampling, so you really don't know the whole picture of what's going on. And then the other pro of this type of sampling is that it's just a simple process. Participants are chosen at random. Some of the cons to a simple random sample is that sample methods can sometimes be difficult to obtain the whole population because, sometimes people don't report, like in this case, when I was doing my needs assessment, sometimes prisons wouldn't report people, returning to incarceration. Police, stations, officers didn't necessarily report rearrests. There was delays in reporting this information, so that, obviously messed with the data. So one of the cons is that your data can be skewed because you don't have a picture of the whole population. And the other con is that it's very time consuming. So if your information isn't available for the whole population, researchers have to spend time to try to find that information to make your data results as unbiased as possible. Because if you're not looking at the population as a whole, you're leaving somebody out. So that doesn't necessarily make your information accurate. As it relates to the needs assessment and which one I would choose, I probably would go with the purposeful sampling, just because the information I came across for the reentry program, there was a lot of mention of evidence-based practices for your implementation, your interventions in your program, but there wasn't a lot of information available online to find. So I just feel like this kind of sampling where you're keeping in mind that evidence-based approach would have been helpful to have that information for this needs assessment.